Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Danley. My pronouns are she, her. I work for the White River Valley Consortium. My position is hosted at Vital Communities. I'm one of the organizers for tonight's webinar. I am not going to be doing much talking. I'm mostly going to be handing it over to three fabulous presenters. I'm just here to start us off with a little bit of housekeeping and background information on this series. So this is our series on expanding ownership, shared equity and collaborative ownership for housing and agriculture. It's a multi-part webinar series. This is the first webinar in the series, and it's an introduction to community land trusts. This webinar series and the network building that is involved throughout the course of this process is a collaborative effort between a number of different organizations, including the Green Mountain Economic Development Corporation, Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission, Vital Communities, and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School. So we actually have a number of different staff who are involved in organizing these 4 different webinars in the series. So down the left-hand column of the slide, you'll actually see a bunch of names. The 2 bolded ones at the top are myself and Fran Miller, who are organizing this first webinar in the series. But later on, if you join us for future webinars, you'll be seeing some other faces as well. And Fran will introduce herself in just a moment. So what is shared equity and collaborative ownership that we're doing this webinar series about? Honestly, we have really struggled with what to call this or how to even encapsulate the whole range of different models that we're interested in talking about with you all. We're interested in looking at things like community land trusts, variations on the community land trust model, ground leases, resident-owned communities, cooperatives, LLCs as a way of owning land, other co-ownership agreements, equity building lease provisions, deed restrictions and conservation easements, really a whole range of different tools. So what do we even call it? We've decided for now to call it shared equity and collaborative ownership, but our understanding of what that even means might change and evolve over the course of the series and through conversations with you. For now, my extremely unofficial description, and I'm not a lawyer, I don't work for a land trust, I'm not a housing expert, so this is very unofficial, but the way I think of the range of stuff that we're looking at is models where individual homeowners, landowners, and land stewards share ownership with each other or with the community in order to make it more affordable to have some ownership. So what is the goal behind looking at this nebulous arrangement of different ownership models? Our goal is, as a community, to think creatively about different ways that land use and land ownership could work in and for our community. It's not to imply that any one of these tools is right for all people or all communities. We're also looking to gain inspiration and insight from great work happening in other states that we may never otherwise stumble across. We're making a deliberate effort to learn from folks in other states, while also recognizing that there are many excellent efforts happening in Vermont already. And this one is really important to the organizers. This is not meant to imply that younger generations or marginalized communities should give up on the opportunity for wealth building or settle for being renters forever. Rather, we're looking to consider tools that could help more people build equity even when traditional solo property ownership is not accessible. So we'll be coming back to some of these themes throughout the webinar series. Session 1 tonight is on community land trusts. What is a community land trust? Our speakers will be talking a little bit more about that, but just to get us started, this definition says that a community land trust is a nonprofit corporation that holds land on behalf of a place-based community while serving as the long-term steward for affordable housing, community gardens, civic buildings, commercial spaces, and other community assets on behalf of a community. And that definition comes from the Center for Community Land Trust Innovation. So as part of exploring what it is, what a community land trust is and what it could look like, our agenda for tonight is to start with a brief introduction and history of CLTs by Fran Miller, the senior staff attorney at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Followed by Nora Lichtash, who is the executive director of the Women's Community Revitalization Project, and she'll be speaking about the formation and current work of the Community Justice Land Trust in Philadelphia. Then we'll be hearing from Johanna Rosen, the Commons Alliance facilitator at the Agrarian Trust, speaking about the agrarian commons model being implemented across the country. We'll definitely have time for Q&A with you all in the audience. And then in our closing, we'll introduce the next webinar in the series. So that's our roadmap for tonight. And I think now we're going to Fran to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Fran Miller. As Sarah said, I am at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School. I work on a variety of projects at CAFS, including developing and supporting community land trusts. I work closely with Joe at Agrarian Trust, and I work just on a variety of projects, including on the White River Land Collaborative project here in Tunbridge. Today, I have been tasked with talking about the history of community land trusts, but I'm really no expert in this history, and I have only recently joined people who've been advocating for and creating this model for decades. And there's a couple of organizations that have been involved in this work for years, including the Center for Community Land Trust Innovation, where Sarah got that definition, and Grounded Solutions. Another one that is not listed on here is Equity Trust. That's an organization that's really been supporting this work also. And most of my research for presenting this history came from the Center for Community Land Trust Innovation. So if you go to that website, there's just enormous resources on there, tons of them. We could go to the next slide, Sarah. You already said this, but I'll just say it again because it can't hurt. What's a community land trust? It's really a broad definition here, a nonprofit corporation that holds land, owns land on behalf of a place-based community while serving as a long-term steward for any of these things: affordable housing, community gardens, civic buildings, commercial spaces, farms, other community assets on behalf of community. And an important piece to the definition is that it's governed by residents of the land or buildings and community representatives and some experts from the community. And I think that we'll probably get more into that later in this series. We're not going to get deep into those definitions today. I will note, though, that community land trusts differ from conservation land trusts. Many of us are familiar with conservation land trusts like Vermont Land Trust or the Upper Valley Land Trust. Their mission is to make sure that farm and forests are protected from development, and they often do this through conservation easements. That is a separate animal, so to speak. Today, we're going to be talking with Nora about a CLT that was formed in Philly, as Sarah referenced, and that focuses, I think, primarily on housing in the city. And we're going to be talking with Joe about a CLT model that holds agricultural land primarily. But of course, housing is important for farming too. Just know that people use the term community land trust to mean different things, and it can apply to both housing and farmland. I think the important piece for us is that the local community owns the land and or buildings through a nonprofit that's governed by that community. We can go to the next slide, Sarah. Sarah looks frozen. Okay. So the roots of CLTs are international, and they stem from community land ownership movements in India, Africa, Latin America, and the UK. Of course, here in America, Indigenous people never believed in private land ownership. Chief Crowfoot, leader of the Blackfeet First Nation, gave a famous speech in 1885 that contrasted his people's attitude towards land tenure with that of the white settlers. And I quote, "We cannot sell the lives of men and animals. Therefore, we cannot sell this land. It was put here for us by the Great Spirit, and we cannot sell it because it does not belong to us. As a present to you, we will give you anything we have that you can take with you, but the land, never." Other people through American history had similar views. Here in America, the CLT movement developed right alongside the civil rights movement. In 1942, land was purchased by civil rights activists to start Kononia Farm in Georgia, which was a civil rights movement space and farm. That farm was boycotted by white businesses, and there was enormous backlash to the interracial nature of the space. But it persevered. It's a Christian community today, and they created the model for the organization that eventually became Habitat for Humanity. In 1967, well-known civil rights activists who had been exploring community-owned models of land ownership traveled to Israel to study what's called the Moshav model of housing cooperative. And they returned to start planning the formation of new communities, which is widely recognized as one of the first established community land trusts in the US. In 1970, new communities purchased 5,600 acres of land in Albany, Georgia, the largest tract of land owned by African Americans in the US at the time. New communities owned the land and they leased buildings and farmland to Black farmers. And the buildings included churches, a community school, and a farmer's market. And then from the 70s forward, there was slow and steady development of CLTs in America. The first National Conference on Land Reform was held in San Francisco in 73, and Earthbridge Community Land Trust was established here in Vermont in Putney, and that continues to this day. Vermont is a real leader in the CLT movement. In 1983, the Burlington City Council and Mayor Bernie Sanders agreed to appropriate $200,000 to seed the creation of a new citywide CLT. Just as an aside, we have tons of resources here in Vermont on CLTs, including John Davis and Burlington Associates, who are early innovators and technical assistance providers to CLTs. So we will take advantage of those resources, but as Sarah said, we're looking outward as well. So through the 80s and 90s, many cities and nonprofits across the country formed CLTs, mostly focused on housing. At least the history I reviewed doesn't talk a lot about CLTs that held agricultural land after new communities. By the mid-1990s, there were 100 CLTs across America. By the mid-2000s, 200. I've seen the number 275 or 300 more recently. There are numerous organizations now working on building CLTs around the country and developing resources for towns and cities interested in the model, which includes community-based ownership of land and housing, taking the land off the speculative real estate market and allowing the local community to regulate the cost of housing and rent for farmland. I'm not going to get into the specifics of exactly what a CLT can be or the legal mechanics, but I'm going to turn this over to Nora and Joe to talk about their respective projects. I think, though, it's important for us to understand as a community that using a CLT to purchase land for farming or housing is an important way that we can make both farmland and housing affordable. We can engage our community and we can manage our community assets for ourselves. And we can be really creative with it, as I think that both Nora and Joe will show us. So I will turn it over to Nora, I believe.
Hi, I'm Nora. I'm from Philadelphia. I'm sitting in Philadelphia right now, and I appreciate being here with Vermonters, and I guess some folks from over the border in New Hampshire too. I am a part of an organization called the Women's Community Revitalization Project. I've actually worked for them for 36 years that it's been around. I was a volunteer before I was on staff, and we also are known as WCRP, and WCRP, along with 8 other organizations in our community, started the Community Justice Land Trust about 12 years ago. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Oops. What I want to do is talk about why we worked with others to establish a land trust, what it took for us to start it, and what we're doing not just in our community, but citywide, to push our elected officials to listen to us and change land disposition policies to benefit community control and permanent affordability. But before I talk about my work, I wanted to understand a little bit more about who's in the webinar. And I'm not that good on Zoom, and so I'm sharing slides, but I'm going to read some statements. And if it's true for you, I'd like you to either put your thumb up on screen or in the reaction box, if you have such a reaction box. Put it up when I read a statement that is true for you. I can't see everyone, but I'm going to be excited anyway, okay? So, and if it's, then I'll read the next slide and you can put your thumb up again if it's true. The first one is, would you please let us know if you grew up in Vermont? And for folks who can see people, did a lot of people grow up in Vermont? Does it seem like it? Because the next slide is put your thumb up if you chose Vermont as your home. Yay. Put your thumb up if you're focused on affordable housing or housing access, please. Put your thumb up if you're focused on farmland access and affordable land for farms. Put your thumb up if you feel the area you live in is affordable. Okay, I didn't say thumbs down, but thumbs down if it's not affordable. 3 more. Put your thumb up if you yourself or someone you know has struggled to find an affordable place to live or to farm. Put your thumb up if you believe that people who live or work in a community should have some say about how development happens in that community. And the last one, put your thumb up if you think enough of us come together that we'll be able to shift policy and resources to increase housing and farmland access. Yay, yes. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my organization, and we do 3 main things. One thing is we build buildings, and that's primarily been residential buildings, although we've built childcare centers and healthcare centers, places for nonprofits, and primarily deeply affordable rental housing that we manage, but we have done lease purchase and some home ownership. Second thing is that we build community amongst our tenants. So once people get an affordable place to live, there's many, many next steps. And they identify those next steps. And usually it's about helping their families or themselves get more money, more education, healthier. And the last thing is building and supporting existing leaders. And we do that by building our voice. And it's primarily people who are experiencing the issue of needing affordable housing or affordable food, and by pushing our politicians to do the right thing. This is the neighborhood that we worked in. On the right is a map of Philadelphia, and that orange square, that's our neighborhood, and it's the orange lines that are in front of you. And all of us who live, work, or worship in this neighborhood have known for a long time that the neighborhood is losing resources. Factories closed down, people down south, overseas, people moved to find jobs, and there were less and less folks in the neighborhood and less services. As a result, the city didn't do as much for us. But it wasn't until we went out with our pencils, colored pencils and maps, and mapped the vacant land in our community, that we found out that 1 out of every 4 addresses, this was in 2008, 2009, 1 out of every 4 pieces of land was either a vacant lot. Everything that's gray is a vacant lot. Everything that's black is a vacant building. And that translated into 70 football fields of vacant land, which doesn't sound like a lot when you live in the country, but in the city, that's a lot of vacant land in one neighborhood. And planners talk about the highest use, most prevalent use in our neighborhood was residential. The second highest use was not a use at all. It was blight or vacancy. And we also found out that 1/4 of our neighborhood was vacant, and 1/4 of that vacant land or vacant buildings was held or owned by the city, some public entity. At the same time as we're mapping this vacant land, we started seeing for sale signs. So what we thought was negative were bad places for our kids to play. We couldn't get insurance. It was like not good. Some people in the neighborhood around us and even in our neighborhood, we're seeing that, in fact, it wasn't negative. It was an asset that they could make money from. And these are just 3 neighborhoods on 3 sides of us that were increasing market values. And we were doing this work in 2008, 2009, and things are really changing. One way of looking at that is, here again is the neighborhood where we work in red. To the left is median sale prices between 2001 and 2002. Everything that's navy blue sold for $40,000 or less. That's like a house. And everything, so then on the right, right before we started mapping and working in the neighborhood and really discussing what vacancy meant to us, you can see 6 years later, there's so much less navy blue. And what you see on the boundaries of our neighborhood, that our properties are starting to sell for above $100,000. So what these 9 organizations and coalition did was what is called, we call a listening project. We've been trained over the years by a group called Rural Southern Voice for Peace that trained us in listening projects. And it's really, the folks got together, the organizations and constituents, and developed a set of questions. And then we go out, it's not scientific, and we ask our friends and our neighbors at church, at mosque, and the home and school, businesses, these questions, go out in teams of 2. And we, amongst the questions on this listening project were, how's the neighborhood changed? How's vacant land affect you? How has it affected the neighborhood? But we also learned that locales, neighborhoods, communities that had market pressure, especially market pressure, but also vacant land, use this tool of community land trusts. So as part of the listening project, we talked to folks about what a community land trust was. Since there was so much publicly owned vacant land, if we could get a hold of that and hold it in a community land trust, and different players could restore it and put it back in use, whether that was for food, housing, businesses, institutions. And the thing that connected the use or the building to the land was a ground lease. And I know that's your next webinar. So we talked about this, and we talked to more than 300 folks. And so when you talk to people and ask them questions, it's your job to come back and report back. So at the top of this slide is our report back meeting. And it was incredible because there was a huge amount of overlap in what people thought is what were issues or questions or concerns about our neighborhood, and also what were assets or strengths in our community. People really had a lot of the same things to say. But this idea of a community land trust, people still were not clear what the heck we were talking about. I'm not sure if we were clear what we were talking about. And our coalition had tried to interview almost all the land trusts in the country before we started this. So about 2 weeks later, we had another community meeting, and we really talked through and we role played and discussed, what does this mean? Can I leave it to my kids? How do I continue affordability if someone moves on? Just all these questions. And at the end of the meeting, people got to take off their name tag and stick it up on a continuum on the wall. Good idea, bad idea. And it was at this meeting that we created the land trust, because most people were right there with us. And this is just logos from some other land trusts. And this was when we can create our land trust. Now, we did not want to create a new organization. So each of the 9 members of our coalition went back to their board and says, who can house this? And since no one else wanted to, and our board talked about it for a long time, but since we had already been doing rental housing and doing property management, we thought there was a connection between property management and stewardship. We weren't sure, but we thought so. So the governance of our land trust is well beyond our organization, but the organization I work for houses it. These are just some pictures at the top. There was a vacant industrial site. The building had been knocked down because it was falling down, and houses were built, and those were lease purchase homes where at the end of an affordability compliance period, the renters can buy the homes. And the funding that came in for this compliance period created affordability. At the bottom is going to be, we're finishing permanently affordable rental housing in a neighborhood where there's no more affordable rental housing. Just a few more a few more points about kind of what we've done in the last 11 years is some lease purchase projects, a very tiny homeownership project. We're just leasing up that permanently affordable rental development in the CLT, and we expect to begin another lease purchase project. We have all the financing in February. But what we realized is that it's not just our neighborhood. We got really clear that other neighborhoods in Philly, many are really struggling with market pressure. Some have not as much vacant land as we have, but substantial amount of vacant land. And so we got together from our neighborhood with other organizations from other neighborhoods to really talk this through about what's happening to them and how can we work together. And one of the outcomes is that we created, together, by working together, a shared vision of permanent or sustained affordability, and have influenced funding sources to understand what we're talking about and why it's not enough to put money in once. You've got to keep it affordable down the road. And so that is true for our Housing Finance Agency, for the district of our Federal Home Loan Bank, which Pennsylvania is part, and our city's Division of Housing. But I'd like to move for just a few minutes on kind of the citywide work, because that's where we get to really influence policy and resource decisions. So here's just one slide, and this is old data, and we've updated it, but it just shows between 2000 and 2016 how the price of land and housing has gone up. I work in North Philly primarily, but at the same time, incomes are not going up. This slide shows we were able to get funding to document where are all these transactions happening. What is the most rapid change? How are prices going up? Here's the map of Philly again, and it's happening in Northwest and South Philadelphia. And there's data, but then there's the people. And here's one data point about what's really actually happening to Philadelphians just around African-American households. In West Philly, you can see more than a third of the households that lived in West Philly in 2000 do not live there in 2016, and it's only gotten worse. So that kind of displacement. And so the current campaign that we're working on is a land justice campaign. We state the problem that Philly has a housing and food affordability crisis. We also put out some data and some stories about the cost of not addressing that problem. And then together in our coalition, we come up with a solution. We don't depend on our elected officials to come up with a solution, but we need to find champions and allies in those elected officials, because they have the power to give us what we want. And we believe we have power over them too, but sometimes they don't believe that. So our solution is that we want to change the way city disposes of publicly owned vacant land and make sure that that land comes back to us in the community. So our coalition is called the Philadelphia Coalition for Affordable Communities. We have these green t-shirts, and it's a very broad coalition. There's 74 organizations citywide in every neighborhood: faith, community, urban, ag, food justice, disability rights, arts, community. I probably said community too many times. And in documenting the problem, when we go to speak to elected officials, we put out data citywide, but we also put out data for each council district. That's who gets to make the decisions about the laws in Philly, mostly our city council. And here we just talk about the problem of how much open space is currently being lost to market rate development and how little our city is doing about it. Again, a slide about folks being pushed out and displacement. We know that half of all renters and a third of all homeowners in our city are housing cost burdened. We know that 1 out of every 5 households doesn't have enough to eat at some point in the year. Putting this information out and then putting it out with a face and people's stories. That's also part of our advocacy work, is data plus stories to give, and data broken down. So our solution is really right now in this campaign to transfer land to the groups that care about community control and permanent affordability. So what we've done in our legislation and working with our champion, really define what these things mean, so that sometimes the city council people think they're smart, but we know that we need to educate them and we need to educate ourselves. And a lot of community education occurs, monthly teach-ins. What is a CLT? If you want to be a CLT, how do you do it? How do you partner with a community land trust? How do you understand what vacant land is in your neighborhood? And what kind of process can happen for folks together to make some decisions about what could happen on that vacant land or vacant building? We show up a lot in our green t-shirts to make sure that the politicians know that we're out there. Here we are in the rain at the first day of city council. And last Thursday, a vote was held on our legislation. And the punchline is that it passed. So now I can stop sharing.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you so much, Nora. So we are going to have questions at the end, but I think let's move on to Joe's presentation, then we'll have questions for all of our speakers at the end, if that works. Joe?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Joe. I steward Pecumtuck land in the Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I work with Agrarian Trust as Commons Alliance facilitator. I have a background in urban agriculture, including in West Philly, regional food system networks, and working with farmers and land trusts, mostly in the Northeast, to ensure that farmland continues to have community benefit. So I'm here on behalf of Agrarian Trust. We are a national land trust with a mission to support land access for next generation farmers. I'm sure much of this will be familiar to you, but just to set the context for why we need community ownership of farmland, from a national perspective, finding farmland that's affordable is the top challenge for young farmers. And communities need farmers to provide food as well as fiber and medicine. And communities also need land for other purposes, including within the agricultural economy, processing, and distribution. With an aging farmer population, we have a real opportunity to pursue land-based justice and community control of land. If we don't do that, the farmland ownership patterns that we see now will continue, with non-farming landowners holding land as second homes and rental properties, and large farms expanding while new farmers are unable to access land. We see pressure from investors, corporations, developers, and even solar. The racial disparity around land ownership is really stark, and we need to look at who's been excluded from opportunities to build wealth and need to imagine new possibilities to ensure that everyone can access land to grow food to support thriving communities. Land values in some areas have increased more than 400% in 15 years, and land ownership is unattainable for most people, with values based on potential for development and extraction being above what farmers can afford on a sustainable farm business income. So often, if they can buy land, farmers are burdened with debt. In the Northeast, we see a big problem as well with even conserved land not being affordable, especially if it's not required to remain in agricultural production. But communities can help address land access challenges for farmers. In our system of land ownership, this colonial legacy, acknowledging the history of injustice, as Fran talked about, that we're on stolen land, and that in the worldviews of many Indigenous peoples, land can't be owned. But in this system of private property, land is treated as a commodity, and on the speculative market, it's expected to appreciate in value. So we need to find another way. Fran talked a little bit about the differences between conservation land trusts and community land trusts. The differences tend to be around governance structures, goals, and the tools they use. There are more and more conservation land trusts now supporting working farms and other working land. And again, Vermont is a leader in this area. And Agrarian Trust looked at these models and decided to create an Agrarian Commons network with Agrarian Trust as the national land trust supporting a network of local community organizations holding land for farming. This structure relies on some of the tools of the community land trust, the long-term ground lease. Again, this gets a little bit wonky, and I know the next session in the series will get more into it. But under the Agrarian Commons model, this is sort of a variation on a CLT with shared equity. And in this structure, the land is held by a commons that has a local board governing it. It's up to that local community to set priorities around racial equity, food production, and requirements around stewardship of soil and habitats. The board of the Agrarian Commons is made up of farmer leaseholders, community stakeholders, and Agrarian Trust representatives. Agrarian Commons offer secure tenure to farmers through long-term leases that are affordable and offer opportunities for ownership of the buildings, whether it's homes or barns or other infrastructure, as a way to build equity. Agrarian Trust provides support using land gifts and fundraising to acquire and invest in the land. This is a map showing the 12 agrarian commons that were launched in 2020 all over the US. So you can see they don't show exact locations, but the idea is to depict that some are statewide and some are regional. They're all at different stages. They're taking different approaches. The details of each project are on our website. I will share a little bit about a few examples. And Fran's a great person to talk to about the Vermont Agrarian Commons. Each commons is expected to eventually hold between 4 and 12 properties. And we're constantly getting inquiries about exploring new projects and encouraging others to continue to adapt this model. The Commons uses a nonprofit structure known as a 501c2. This is a little overly technical, but I just want to recognize that the community is impacted by decisions about who holds the land and how. So the recommendation is to identify the community goals and then create a structure around that rather than necessarily modeling off a particular structure, but looking at are the people making the decisions the ones who are in relationship with the land? And is there a support ecosystem? Business services for farms, technical assistance. I know there are a lot of Vermont service providers on this call. And again, Vermont is really rich in these sorts of resources. Again, this is a little technical, but the terms of the ground lease are really important to ensure that they're providing security to farmers that differentiate them from the more common leasing arrangements and the insecurity of handshakes. It's really up to the local commons board to adapt the lease to the local needs in each case. So I'm going to share a few examples just to show the kind of variety of approaches and the different ways that the projects evolve. But I just want to reiterate that it is still very early in the life of all of these projects as they were just launched 2 years ago. So this is the Little Juba Central Maine Agrarian Commons, which was the first project that Agrarian Trust fundraised for acquisition of the land. The lease in this case is to the Somali Bantu Community Association, which is a nonprofit organization. They had had a lot of experience with short-term leases and insecurity and found that they could not get grants or loans for the farm business without more security. We also see themes around community acceptance and the need to invest in infrastructure coming up in this and other projects. At Liberation Farms, there are over 200 families growing there now, and it's benefiting the community's food sovereignty and providing educational programs for youth. The West Virginia Agrarian Commons is another lease to a nonprofit farm. In this case, the County Farmland Protection Board played a really important role using money that they had access to do a buy, protect, sell project. This project is women-led and it's in an area that's heavily impacted by extraction. And they also have needed to invest a lot in infrastructure. The Southwest Virginia Agrarian Commons, some commons start with land. This one started with a farmer. Cam Terry had been growing food on borrowed and leased land on multiple parcels across the city of Roanoke. He's growing for farmers markets and restaurants. And after a land search in this urban area, he was able to find a property that had been in previous agricultural use on over 3 acres to expand his business. So Agrarian Trust was able to help support the fundraising for this project. I believe it's still underway, but he's partnering with nonprofit youth programs, and he's already growing on this land under a short-term lease to allow him to build soil and plant perennials and invest in infrastructure. Once the purchase is completed, the land will be transferred to the commons and they will be able to provide him with long-term tenure. The Central Virginia Agrarian Commons is an interesting example. It's a BIPOC-led commons and it spans both urban and rural properties. It started with a donation of a farm of 80 acres by an older white couple. And there was also a land search in this case for an urban parcel and a fundraising campaign to purchase 3 acres next to a school, which is helping to build connection with food and land for the youth in this community. And this diagram is just meant to show the sort of flows where Agrarian Trust is raising money to buy the land and then transferring the property to the Agrarian Commons, which is providing the lease. And this also shows some of the community involvement. The Agrarian Commons structure is based on and inspired by cooperatives, community land trusts, conservation land trusts, the CSA concept, and other work before, much of which Fran shared about. And just to say that, again, this is the beginning and we're really experimenting. We need a variety of approaches to this. And through the Commons Alliance Network, we're hoping to share resources and learning to support all kinds of community ownership projects. To share a few other kind of variations, these tools and structures can be used in different combinations to meet community needs. So there are a variety of nonprofits that are not sort of traditional CLTs using the tool of the ground lease in agricultural projects. So there are kind of single site land trusts that are community organizations. There are conservation land trusts that might have a property or two that they're leasing to farmers with a ground lease. These are just some of the examples I know of. They're clustered in the Northeast, which provides a lot of good learning opportunities. And at the top of the list is Caretaker Farm, and I know the lessees there will be speaking in the next session. So that's really exciting. There are rural CLTs that sometimes still are mostly focused on housing, but have farmer lessees, including the one Fran mentioned in Vermont, Earthbridge, which is now home to Milkweed Farm. So some of them are leasing to farm businesses, some provide land for home gardens or community gardens, different kinds of community projects or different combinations. There are CLTs in urban areas, so, supporting urban agriculture in various ways, including WCRP, and not necessarily using that ground lease tool. And there are intentional communities with agriculture. So just encouraging a really broad view of how we approach this. And I would encourage everyone to connect with Agrarian Trust. And again, if you're interested in the Vermont Commons, Fran is a great resource. So I want to thank you for listening and encourage you to reach out with any questions beyond the discussion we'll have.
Great, thank you so much, Joe, and thank both of you so much. I find both of those stories really inspiring, and not just like the details of the different ways these tools are being used, but the process of community building and how the communities are thinking about land access. So we have about 15 minutes left in this webinar. I'm probably going to need about two minutes at least for closing, but the rest of the time left can be a conversation, take questions from the audience, have a conversation with our panelists. Why don't we do that by using the raise hand function? If you can't do that and you're on video, you can also raise your physical hand. I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. Tara, I see you first.
Yes, hi there. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been really interesting. I am in coastal Maine working on a community purchase for farmland and also affordable housing. So this is right up our alleys. I am curious about some of the answers to questions like, can I pass it down to my kids? There is a community land trust in a local community here where the folks have been there about 30 years. And one of the things that they have found now with some of those people getting older and wanting to sell a parcel, that because they don't own the land, they just own the house, people wanting to purchase couldn't get a bank loan to purchase, and it's gotten awkward, and they wish that they had done some things differently. So I know people are beginning to think about this in different ways. I've spoken with the folks at Land in Common. And I just wonder what you guys are seeing or thinking in terms of how do we build equity and what can we pass down or sell or whatever.
Can I start, or do you want to start?
Yeah, go for it.
So for us, the idea of building equity was really important, and you never do a hard sell on community land trust properties, buildings, because if people can buy on the open market, they don't need a CLT. But we work with folks who can't buy on the open market. And so they're buying homes or buildings that have been subsidized through, because we are a nonprofit and we are a CLT, but embedded in the ground lease. And when you work on a ground lease, it's really fun and interesting because all of your ideas are put in that ground lease about how much equity when you sell you can get. How does that equity accrue? When does it accrue? Like just all the rules about things. And of course, in our CLT, and I think most CLTs, you can leave it to your heirs. But when you do sell, if you do sell, there is a calculation in the ground lease about what you will receive, and that the next family also needs to, or the next farmer needs that affordability. In terms of getting mortgages, I mean, we have worked a lot with banks that understand this, and we've pushed banks through our local Federal Home Loan Bank. They're all members. There's a district that every state is in, and talking to people. And we have pushed guidelines so that our projects can be funded, and there are bankers that understand that and work with us in Pennsylvania.
Great. Joe or Fran, anything to add?
I would just add that I just got off a Zoom today from the farmland financing group in the Farm to Plate network here in Vermont. And one of the issues that we are grappling with and talking about is the very issue about financing that you're raising, about, being able to buy the house, but not the land. And I also know people who've struggled with that here. And I think it's interesting what you're saying, Nora, because I think there is an advocacy piece to this. It's really, as we're doing in this series, but also particularly talking with the financing folks, whether it's a regular bank, a community bank. There's a lot of alternative financing possibilities here, VITA, the Vermont Economic Development folks. So I think we really have to do a strong job of educating and advocating for this model to be able to be financed.
And I guess if you want our people from our Federal Home Loan Bank to talk to your people from your Federal Home Loan Bank, they would probably do that, or from our housing finance agency. I think because they've kind of become converts in believing that once money is invested, it should stay in. So some of the most conservative folks are supporters of this.
Yeah, that's great.
Joe, unless you have anything else to add. Mikey, I've got you next.
Yeah, I was just going to respond a little bit further to that, since at Land for Good, we work with these scenarios. And, one of the issues that just comes up with lenders is just their ability to foreclose in the case of a default. And so there has to be a lot of thought in the legal structure that, allows for foreclosure, or otherwise the bank to feel that they have security in case of a default. And that's sometimes, particularly in some of these older situations, that's what gets overlooked.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Other questions? I did have one question I wanted to ask the panelists while other folks gather the thoughts or find the raise hand button, which I would love to hear you speak a little bit more about the community building that happens through these models, either by the process of developing them or what that experience is like for people who are residents of these models. I don't know if either of you has any insight to share on that.
Nora, do you want to start?
Okay, yeah, so I mean, I guess this sounds weird, but I think it was fun for us to get together and say, what is this ground lease thing, and how do we want to write ours? And that was really important. In our neighborhood, there's a lot of families who are from Puerto Rico that can go back and forth and someday would like to retire there, or going back to take care of their families. So just kind of the rules of how many months you need to live in your house, and I don't know if this sounds like fun, but just going back and forth so folks understand each other, to develop the rules that are going to be the rules around your ground lease. In our organization, our homes are designed by design professionals as well as people who will live in the houses or are currently living in the houses. There's just so many opportunities to build people's skills and for there to be an exchange. Like the designers may not get at all what's needed in those homes, but the people who are going to live in them know. So that idea that community comes together and everyone brings their expertise, no one knows everything and everyone knows something, I think that really occurs. And then if you are pushing the elected officials, people get a chance in community to talk about their story and talk about it knowledgeably, and also understand the data and say, I'm not the only one experiencing this. This number of sisters and brothers are having this same issue in your district. So the community building opportunities just really come up, and then solving them or working on them together is what really builds a strong community.
Great, thank you, Nora. Phil, why don't we take a question from you?
Yeah, a comment and a question. So I was at Cobb Hill when it was created, don't live there anymore, but interestingly, after a lot of study of a governance and ownership model, we looked at co-ops, we looked at land trusts, a few other things I can't remember, but what we came down on in our situation was a condominium association, which surprised us at first, but there were a few reasons. One was that banks understood, we needed a bank construction loan. Banks understood what a condominium association was up here. They didn't understand any of the others. And that was kind of true of the towns and Act 250 and so forth too. So that was just interesting. I don't know if it would still be the case, but that's what was practical for us. And so everybody owns their living unit and has an undivided interest in all the farmland and leases it to the farmers for $1 a year. My question is, in these various models of land trusts and other models, is the relationship between the farmer and whatever board or governance situation there is, how much control does the farmer have over the use of the land, their business model, and so forth? How much are they working with the board? I'm sure there are variations and differences, but I'd be curious if there's, what people have to say about that. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. I can start. I mean, it's sort of similar to what Nora was saying about the home design. In the case of affordable housing, you want the farmer at the table sort of saying what the needs are to have that reflected in the lease terms. And I think you're right that there are a lot of variations, but the goal is to have the farmer have autonomy over their business model and their operations within certain parameters. So Agrarian Commons has set out values around stewardship, soil building, regenerative practices, protecting habitat, that sort of thing. And so that's sort of maybe the baseline, but then beyond that, there's negotiation about what the specific terms would be, and that the farmer lessees should have representation on the board to help determine what those lease terms are.
Great, thanks, Joe. Mike, we've got time for one more comment, I think, and then I'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just mention that as we've worked, I've been quite familiar with Earthbridge Community Land Trust down here, and they have at least 4 farmers. And similarly to what was just said, they basically, within the context of their lease and stewardship expectations, they have full autonomy over what their businesses are, what they look like, how they capitalize them otherwise, what, infrastructure, including also what infrastructure they build on the property. They have to still, any construction projects has to be approved by the board, which does include members, of course, or is primarily members. And so there are farmers on that will comment. And so that would be the most involvement I think that the board would have would be in the construction of buildings, agricultural buildings, but otherwise the farms really have autonomy. I put in the chat, we just had someone from Earthbridge speak on a webinar that our organization did last week. It's not up on our YouTube channel yet, but will be before the next of these webinars.
And Mike, I can add the link to that to the follow-up email that goes out with the recording of this webinar. I think that'd be a great resource to add in as well. Thank you. Great. So I hate to cut the conversation off, but I do want to make sure we end on time and also have a couple of wrap-up notes. Let me see if that screen share worked again. Did that work? Okay. Okay. So all of us have mentioned a number of Vermont organizations. So again, getting back to the beginning, we didn't want to not mention the Vermont organizations. We're just trying to deliberately take this opportunity to learn from folks in other states. But there are many wonderful organizations in Vermont. I won't rehash the ones that have already been mentioned, but just wanted to call out the first two on this are two additional housing trusts that serve the Upper Valley area of Vermont. And then Champlain Housing Trust, which is one of the ones that has already been mentioned, is confirmed that they will be a speaker on a later webinar in the series. So stay tuned for more from them. So the next webinar in the series is on ground leases, really fun, nitty-gritty legal topic. So the intent was that this webinar is the overview of the community land trust model, how a community can even think about it, decide whether it's right for them. And next we'll be looking more closely at the legal mechanics and specifically how that affects the people who are residing on that property or farming on that property. So our speakers will be, as mentioned, two farmers from Caretaker Farm, Bridget and Dawn. So they'll be speaking about their experiences as using ground leases as part of their land access arrangement and what that means to them. And then also in the chat was mentioned a ROC, which is a resident-owned community. So ground leases can be a really powerful tool, but they are also a tool that can be, they also can open up the opportunity for disenfranchisement. And one of the places where that often happens is in manufactured home communities. So manufactured home communities are often done using ground leases where the residents own the mobile home, but not the land underneath. But a mobile home or manufactured home is actually very difficult or impossible to move. So the ground lease can actually be used to allow the park owner to increase the land rent basically with a captive tenant. So one of the models that has come out to fight this issue is a ROC, or resident-owned community, which still uses the difference between individual ownership of the structure and separate from the ownership of the land, but it's actually a co-op that owns the land. So we'll be looking a little bit more closely at ground leases and what that experience can be like. And again, how do we move the needle always to more equity and more empowerment for the residents and tenants? So hopefully that's a good pitch to get you involved in something that's about a specific type of lease. Promise it'll be interesting. And finally, the very last note is that we also wanted to host the series to help people connect with each other and learn from each other. I think this conversation in the last 15 minutes has been great for that. We're going to try and experiment with a way of letting you all connect with each other if you're interested. So we have created a Google Jam board. I will put the link into the chat in a second. And this is a place where you can essentially post virtual sticky notes if you would like to do so, with your name and your contact information and what subjects you either have information about, what projects you've been involved in, or what questions you'd like to have answered, or people you would like to connect with, and really think of it as like a board in a co-op where you can post information to try and find each other. And we wanted to do this outside of just the chat function in our Zoom webinar so that we can keep it going across the 4 webinars of this series. So I'll put that link into the chat in just a second, and you'll also get that emailed out in your follow-up materials. It's an experiment. We'll see how it goes. There will definitely be other ways of following up with you all as well. So that's what we have for tonight. Thank you all so much for participating. Any final words or thoughts from any of our presenters or anyone from the audience? Great.
Sarah.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.